Good evening. I'm Bill Gavigan. I'm the Director of Amity Adult Education, and it's under Amity Adult Education's auspices that we are putting on this local history. Last year, the Adult Advisory Board considered doing local histories. Maybe last year you attended the history of Woodbridge, which we had at Woodbridge, and we had the history of Orange. And we thought we'd stop there, but the groundswell of public opinion said, no, we can't stop there. We have to complete the cycle. And we're doing a history of Bethany tonight. Also, I should tell you that on Thursday, down in Orange, we're doing history of Old Stafford Rock. And if that touches a chord with you, we'll be down in the Amity Junior High of Orange library. And as you know, they have, down in West Cape, actually put out a book. I think it's Gil Sullivan is Gil Johnson, thank you. He's put out a book. Man, I forgot the other man's name. Bill Dorman. Yeah, Dorman. They are putting this, they put on this, they published this book, and they're going to put on this presentation of Old Stafford Rock, and you're welcome to go there. Out plus so if you register at 10, we have plenty of room. Tonight, of course, Bob Brinton is going to be the presenter, and Bob has so many titles I've forgotten all of them, but I know he is the municipal town historian, elected office, and he's also the chairman of the Bethany Historical Society, the Bethany Woodbridge Historical Society, and many other historical societies. I guess I don't touch all places here, but I can't wait to hear Bob Brinton speak about the history of Bethany. Bob.
I want to thank you all for coming. Glad to see such a large turnout for kind of a small town. As usual, Bethany is overrepresented in its participation, and I think that's something you should be proud of. I think before we start in talking about Bethany history, I've learned enough from television to know that you start off with a commercial before people are asleep. So number one, I want to mention that we now have a Bethany Historical Society. It's a week old as of today. We have about 105 members, and we would urge any of you who have not become members to consider becoming a member. My oldest son, Robert, will be at the back table at the end, and if you want to either become a member or pick up a membership form, if you have already not done so, I would encourage you to do that. In addition, we brought along, for your convenience, a few books on Bethany history. As a matter of fact, we brought along all of the books on Bethany history. This is all that exists. And I won't go into detail, but I would suggest that on the way out, you might want to peruse the display. Remember, Christmas is coming, and it's never too soon to start your Christmas shopping. Take a break. Okay, Hazel Hoppy is here, who wrote one of the books, and she probably would be willing to autograph a copy. What, for an extra $5? And I don't think Alice Pumpkin is here. No, so she can't autograph. But I'm sure that can be arranged.
They're already autographed.
They're already autographed? Okay. Not a rubber stamp or anything?
No.
Okay. Getting on to the history of Bethany, this is an almost impossible task. Milt called me and said, gee, could you do a brief talk on the history of Bethany? I said, no. Anybody that knows me knows I can't give a brief talk on anything, much less the history of Bethany. What I've chosen is to kind of drag this out and give you 2 nights instead of one. I thought, well, if I spent one night tonight talking about the 18th century and the 19th century, then the next meeting we'll just talk about the 20th century, because so many things happened in the 20th century. So many of you were here to see those things happen, and you probably can share things that I don't know, and you probably can correct me on things that I am misinformed about. Before we turn off the lights, there's one item I wanted to read to you. I don't like to usually read to people, but I ran across this we're going to be talking about Bethany as a wilderness to begin with, and this is an excerpt from a letter written by Timothy Hitchcock in 1873 to his nephew. He was 82 years old at the time, and evidently his nephew, we don't know his nephew's letter, his nephew must have said, "Gee, Granddad, tell me what it was like coming to Bethany." And his letter starts out, "Dear nephew, I will now try to comply with your request as far as I can remember and have any knowledge of our family. I remember hearing my father and mother tell of his father, Ebenezer Hitchcock, my grandfather, moving in 1747 from New Haven into Bethany, about 3/4 of a mile southwest of the center. 3/4 of a mile southwest of the center is about where we're sitting right now. Into a wilderness with bears and wolves, no roads, only paths made by riding on horseback or on foot. I have heard my father say that Grandmother Hitchcock said that when they moved from New Haven to Bethany, the neighbors came over with sorrowful faces and cried and shook hands and said goodbye as though they were never to see each other again." I kind of like that because it gives you a little bit of an idea of the attitude, the remoteness of Bethany at that time, and the remoteness of Bethany just about here where we're sitting this evening. That's all I'm going to read to you tonight. All right, if we could have the lights after we get the machine going here. This is up. I mean, I have to do this by myself. I don't do technical stuff. How's that? Does that look all right? Okay, we're familiar with this. This is our town seal. This is what we think of Bethany as. It's really not like that today. Amity Road doesn't really look like that, but this is how we think of Bethany. This is what we would like Bethany to be. And this is what Bethany used to be as we're going to be seeing. I put this in here. Some of you may recognize this. This is the mural that was done in 1934 when our community school was built. It was a WPA project, a make-work project, but it was a beautiful job. This is actually a photograph of a copy of it because it no longer hangs in the school. Well, actually it does. The copy was put in the library. Now that the library is closed, it's back in the town hall in the selectmen's conference room. On the left-hand side, you can see a map of Bethany, kind of a conjectural map of Bethany in the early 1800s. Plenty of animals. In the center, you'll see a bear being shot. The story goes that the last bear was shot in Bethany in 1797. So it's certainly, Ebenezer Hitchcock certainly wasn't exaggerating when he said he came into a wilderness with bears and wolves. The right-hand side shows some of the highlights of the early history, which we're going to be going into in just a little more detail. You realize, however, we're not going to be able to say very much about anything if we're covering 200 years in less than an hour. This is basically a survey. It's going to get you so interested that you're going to want to get involved. And we certainly hope that we can have future programs. Almost every one of these topics we're going to be talking about could be a program in itself. This is an early photograph, probably taken around 1900 when photography was just beginning to be readily available to people. Holmes Fort. And you couldn't take a photograph of that today. Not that it's not there, but it is so grown up that you couldn't get this kind of a picture. You notice in 1900 it was already growing up. You already see cedar trees growing up through a extremely rugged pasture area. This is located near the Bethany Woodbridge line, just north of Seymour Road, and is on the land that is scheduled to be part of the Bethany Farm subdivision. What's special about Holmes Fort? Well, actually not very much, except that it's mentioned several times in 17th and 18th century descriptions. For instance, there is a story that the regicides, Whaley and Goff, hid out here and used this as a lookout point. Remember, they hid out at Judge's Cave when the king's men were pursuing them after the restoration of Charles II. And these regicides or king killers hid out on West Rock. They came to Woodbridge. They hid out at a place called Hatchet Harbor, and they evidently used this as a lookout. Another account says that they observed fires here by the Indians. And at this time, at the time the settlers first came, this was an area that was inhabited by Indians. In 1638, settlers came to New Haven. In the following year, some of those people moved west to Milford. And it eventually turned out that we had two separate settlements, the New Haven and Milford settlements, and their line ran through the town of Bethany, and this still, to this day, has impact on the town. The line between the Milford and the New Haven colonies ran through Holmes Fort and at the south, through the center of Bethany, through the Bethany Farm subdivision, up until a few decades ago. There was still a stone on that property that marked one of the marking stones that marked the division between the two colonies. The northern terminus of that line was the Three Brothers. And these are it's really a chestnut tree that had three leaders. It is recorded in the 17th century. 17th century, they mentioned the Three Brothers as being a boundary line. As a matter of fact, in 1673, there was a big argument about who owned the Three Brothers. Was it part of Milford? Was it part of New Haven? The story goes, or the legend is, that the settlers from New Haven and the settlers from Milford chose their very best fighters, and that the two champions of the two colonies met underneath this tree and fought from 10 o'clock until dusk. The winner was going to be the one who would determine where the line would be. It was called a draw at dusk, and it was decided that the Three Brothers would be the dividing line. Interestingly enough, the Three Brothers are still there. I've walked to it. The trees are still there. The chestnut blight that swept the state starting about 1905 killed the Three Brothers. Probably took a long time for them to die. Took a while for them to collapse and fall on the ground, and they still are lying in that configuration. This was probably taken only maybe a decade ago, something like that. Chestnut's an excellent wood, by the way. That's why they used to make fence posts of it. The pile of stones in the center is significant because that's the boundary marker. Pile of stones today. Not very high tech. Okay, basically what we're seeing here is it's not a very accurate map. It's actually about 1766 or shortly thereafter, and it's the first one that shows Bethany. They don't know how to spell it, but it shows Bethany. And the little rectangular area to the west of Bethany is the so-called Milford Race. And the Milford Race is a strip of land that originally was part of the Milford colony. It was purchased from the Indians in two separate purchases called the one-bit purchase and the two-bit purchase. Actually, the two-bit purchase came first. The two-bit purchase was for the southern part, the one-bit purchase for the northern part. Now, just to make this a little more meaningful to those of you who live in Bethany, if you can think of Pole Hill Road, basically the area to the west of Pole Hill Road is the Milford Race, between the Pole Hill Road and the Bethany line. To the east of Pole Hill Road was originally part of the New Haven colony. And the western part is the part that was bought from the Pagusset Indians, if you have some interest in that topic.
Just wait.
We won't advertise that, however. The interesting thing about this is it shows that Bethany already had a church. This came about because I don't know how many of you realize how almost every early Connecticut town was formed. It first was formed by a church being organized. The political end of it came much later, or it certainly came later, because at that time we had a theocracy. There was no separation of church and state. The Congregational Church was supported by tax funds. I know it's hard to believe. Up until 1818, when the Congregational Church was disestablished. First, what they used to do is, as they did it in Amity, now Woodbridge, or many other places, first thing they would do is they would ask for winter preaching privileges. By 1738, people were coming out to Woodbridge, living in Woodbridge, and they found that it was tough to go back to New Haven on Sunday for services. It was a long journey, but it was impossible in the winter. Roads were not plowed. So they would say, can we have our own minister? Can we have our own services in the winter? And usually that came first. Subsequent to that came the full rights to have a church, creation of a separate parish, and then after that came the establishment of the town itself. The town would break away, and the town usually coincided with the parish that it grew out of. In the case of Bethany, we have winter preaching privileges. Then we have, in 1762, we have the establishment of the very first church that was built just for a church. This is a picture of one of Alice Bunton's, a map that Alice Bunton included in her Bethany's old houses and community buildings. And the shaded area shows the Milford race. And the dark green shaded area is the part of the Milford race that's now part of Bethany. Because Bethany, as you're going to find out, changed in size over the years. This is Pole Hill Road. Again, this is and was a major dividing line between the two colonies. We're up into the early 18th century now. The reason I put this in here is because I can't tell you the exact spot that East Bethany was settled by Samuel Downs and his family. This is the corner of Carmel Road and Downs Road, looking north. The Downs genealogy says that Samuel settled south of Madmere Mountain, and that's exactly where we are here. This is an early photograph of the original Downs homestead. Well, Samuel Downs moved to Bethany in 1717. I doubt that he lived in this house. This is a little bit too late. This is probably the second Downs house. The date would be, it's kind of hard to tell. The house is now gone, but it's probably closer to Revolutionary War times that was built. This particular map is kind of interesting. This dates from about 1792, and it shows the so-called county road. I'm hoping that you can see it, which was laid out in in the 17th century, late 17th century, but was surveyed in 1722. And this is the Woodbridge Church, Bethany Congregational Church. The road goes from the southeast part of Woodbridge up through Bethany and up through the Straits. This is going into Naugatuck. This is not to scale, but it does give us considerable amount of information. This section, for instance, is probably present-day Amity Road. Probably this section right here. This section is present-day Litchfield Turnpike in the northern part of the town. This is probably present-day Litchfield Turnpike in the southern part of the town. The West River, the Sargent River are here. It gives us some bearings. Interestingly enough, it does show the first Episcopal church in Bethany, which was built in 1786. And there it is. This is a church and this is a meeting house. Since this map was made when the Congregational Church was still the official church, that is only Congregational churches that had this symbol. These are just called meeting houses because these are other groups like the Episcopal Church. This Episcopal Church probably didn't amount to much because it was built in 1785 and was torn down in 1803. So it probably wasn't very substantial. My understanding is it was never finished on the inside. It must have been pretty rough. It was located at the intersection of Tuttle Road, not Tuttle Court, Tuttle Road, and Carrington Road, known as Church Corner. If you go there today, you're certainly not going to find, well, I'll go back. We're going to see it in a minute. You're not going to find anything but a field. I want to point out one other thing, a little bit out of context here, is that even in the late 18th century, notice we have these symbols. This stands for grist mill, sawmill. Grist mill, sawmill there. There's another one I can't find. That's a grist mill. We're not quite sure. This is probably Valley Road or something like that, because the original Congregational Church stood on the Bethany Green, and the Bethany Green was located on Dayton Road, on the northern side of Dayton Road near Amity Road. And when the original church was built there in 1762, that was recognized as the Green. It wasn't until later, when the present church was built, that the old Congregational Church was torn down and the green was sold. How many people knew we had a green? Something new?
Al Mayer.
Al Mayer, yeah. The green was in the vicinity of Al Mayer's house, if anybody knows Al Mayer. Okay, what's this big rock here? This big rock is at the intersection of what is now Old Amity Road and Myers Road. And this is known today, and was known in the 18th century as Rocky Corner, for obvious reasons. And this was the site of the very first schoolhouse in Bethany. Now it's interesting. Before we had a church, before we had any other building, our first municipal building was a schoolhouse, and it was built in 1750 near this location. Obviously not on the rock, but near this location. Incidentally, it was also used as a meeting house for that winter preaching, and also was used for any other community functions. It was the only community building at that time. As mentioned before, the Congregational Church was built in 1762. This sign, of course, is in front of our later Congregational Church, which was built in 1831. Reverend Stephen Hawley was the first minister in Bethany. He started preaching, I believe, in 1763. And very unusual for those days, he stayed. He stayed in Bethany for 40 years, which is a considerable period for an early minister to minister to his flock. It was very popular. This gravestone was in the old cemetery in Bethany. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the old cemetery. At the end of Myers Road. If you get on Myers Road, you go by a wonderful old farm. And then the road turns to gravel, and at the very end of the road, you come across an old cemetery, the oldest one in town. It was, I believe it was first used in 1755. This is what the this is a artist's or a conceptual idea of what the first meeting house looked like from early accounts. There are no photographs, no paintings. One problem with telling you about the early period of Bethany history is there's not very much visual, so I had to kind of dig for these. But this is typical of the early period meeting house, where the entrance is on the lawn side rather than being on the end of the building where the bell tower is. This is showing you the present intersection of Dayton and Amity Road, and all of this area would have been the Bethany Green. Exactly how far it extended, no one knows. I've asked Mr. Mayor if he's ever found any evidences, any bits of metal or stone foundations or well or anything, and he said no, there's nothing. It's completely gone. This is a monument in the old cemetery commemorating Revolutionary War veterans. And we just put this in to remind you that we had a war here in the late 18th century, and the war certainly involved Bethany. A lot of Bethany people went to war, some didn't come back. Same as happens with all wars. And these are the Revolutionary soldiers. And the old cemetery is where they can be found. This is an early picture of the so-called Dayton House. The house still stands on Amity Road, just south of Valley Road on the east side. It's almost across, at this point, it's almost across from the intersection that we saw a moment ago with Dayton Road. As a matter of fact, Dayton Road used to cross Amity Road. Quite steep. They didn't have cars to worry about in those days. But the green would be up here. Dayton Road that we just saw crossed and went right down and met Valley Road. The present layout of the upper end of Valley Road is more recent. By more recent, it might be early 19th century or something like that. Still called the New Road. It takes a couple hundred years before it gets to be an old road. That's how small towns are. You know, those of you who moved into town and moved into a house that was already built, you realize that you're always living in somebody else's house. You always live in so-and-so's house. You never live in your own house. But there's one good thing. Someday, long after you're gone, it'll be your house. This particular house you may not recognize today because it's been turned 90 degrees and moved about 300 feet to the north to allow the highway to be widened in the 1930s. Why are we showing you this house? Because it has a connection with the Revolutionary War. This is where Captain Dayton lived. He was a privateer, which is just a nice way of saying pirate. He stole from the British, so I guess being a privateer is a license to steal, if there ever was one. And he was not very popular with the Tories, and there were a lot of Tories in Long Island. A group of them came over, rode over from Long Island on purpose to come to Captain Dayton's house because they had heard that he had amassed considerable treasures, and they assumed that he had them hidden in his house. So in 1780, this group of Tories came up the Naugatuck River. They landed in Derby. They met with some friendly Tories at a tavern that's still standing in Seymour, and came to Bethany in the dark of night and broke into the house. Captain Dayton was away, but the women folk were at home, and they were pretty helpless. They were tied up. The house was ransacked. They didn't find as much treasure as they would like to have found, and they were somewhat disgruntled. They took off to the north because they were afraid of an alarm being sounded and being captured. Just very briefly to follow the story along, I could spend a whole night on this. They went north through Beacon Falls, worked their way over to the north and west till they got to the river again, came down the river, crossed to Long Island, and put up at a tavern for the night after probably some self-congratulatory reveling. Following that, on the way, they met a boy by the name of Chauncey Judd and kidnapped him. Twice they attempted to kill him, but he survived. This is a book about the incident that was written in the late 19th century. Just to end the story, a posse, I guess you'd call it, got together of neighbors in Bethany and further to the north, and they followed the trail. The trail was a little bit cold, but they were able to get enough information that they pursued the captors of Chauncey Judd down the river, across Long Island Sound, and were able to find them, surprised them in the tavern while they slept after their evening of celebration, captured them and brought them back. The leader stood trial and ended up going to famous Newgate Prison in Granby. I promised you this earlier. This is a picture of the field that stands at Church Corner. Hard to believe that there was an 18th century church on this site. Driving by it today, it would probably be the last thing in your mind. All right, we're not going to do too much on roads, because those of you who showed up last week at our first Bethany Historical Society meeting probably found out more about roads than you really wanted to know. But one road, or two roads in Bethany, kind of epitomize the town. And they have been the main north-south roads in Bethany since the 17th century, since the very first people started walking along trails. And these are Amity Road and Litchfield Turnpike. This is an 1817 map. Actually, it's better than I showed a week ago. The one a week ago was not quite that clear. This is a Xerox of it, and it seems to be a little better. This is entitled The Survey of the Straits Turnpike. The Straits Turnpike is present-day Litchfield Turnpike. This is just about the Bethany line. This is probably where Carrington Road intersects. Carrington Road goes like that. And this is the end of Amity Road. And those of you who remember, before we had house numbers, and we used to call Litchfield Turnpike, instead of calling the north end of it Amity Road, would recognize that this is the intersection of Amity Road and Litchfield Turnpike. You notice on this road, which is a very straight Amity Road, it says Shunpike. And it was called that because this is a road that people would take to shun or avoid the toll gate that stood down on the flats. They did, however, hit the toll gate here, which was in the northern part of the town, right near where Route 42 now crosses. The school that was later built here was called Gate School. And this area is the Straits. That's the narrow area between the mountains as you're going from Bethany into present-day Naugatuck. And this is the house where the toll gate was located. And these are the Straits. Edwards Road is here, and around the corner is going to be the Bethany line. So what you're seeing is Bethany. Just out of view is the line. And I think you can see that if you were traveling on foot or on horseback or with a wagon or a stagecoach or whatever you were using, this would be certainly a lot easier to go through here than to go over the mountains. This is kind of a nice shot showing the only surviving watering trough on the old Litchfield Turnpike. And this is in front of Russ Winter's house, north of Munson Road. And this was maintained by the town until 1923 at town expense for horses. So I showed you it took us a long time to switch over from a horse to the car. Are we switching back? I'm not sure. This is we're coming up to the Hoadley House. And I bring this up because this was had the largest meeting room in the town of Bethany, in the ballroom on the second floor, and it was in this room that town meetings were held sometimes, and that the Episcopal Church services were held between 1803, when the old Episcopal Church on Church Corner was torn down, and 1809, when the present Episcopal Church was built.
Where is that located?
That's still there. This is Falls Road, and just off the picture in this area is Hilldale Road. It's the Hoadley House. And this is the Episcopal Church, built in 1809. If you notice, another reason I have it here, if you notice similarity between them. It's because they were designed by the same architect, David Hogan. There are some similarities in the trim and the decoration and the ornament. It's an extremely beautiful country church. Incidentally, those of you who drive by every day, you may or may not know this is really not a window. That's one of David Hogan's little tricks. It's really just a board painted black with a kind of a white webbing of trim to indicate muntins on a window. That window doesn't exist. You'll notice, I believe, the Congregational Church in Orange, which was also designed by Hoadley, has a similar false window or blind window, as they call it. This particular painting ties together a few ideas. We don't have much room for slides, so every slide has to tell a couple of stories. One story about this is that it was inspired by the Episcopal Church in Bethany. True, there are differences. This particular church has a bell tower that stands in front of it, similar to the one in Orange, rather than like the one in Bethany. But the buildings, this building, the layout of it is very similar to the layout of the Episcopal Church. This particular painting, this is actually a chromolithograph from the 19th century that was made from a painting by George Dury. I don't know how many of you are familiar with George Dury, very famous painter of the Hudson River School, who worked out of New Haven, lived in New Haven. He did mostly portraits at first. And one portrait he did was for the Wheelers in the Hoadley house. And in those days, doing oil portraits was a time-consuming process. You could not just click a shutter. So he spent some time with them, lived with them probably for weeks. While he was there, he attended this church, our Episcopal Church. And while there, he had the occasion to meet a Sarah Perkins. Okay, now we're going to tie into another slide. You remember that red house that was the location of the early toll gate on the turnpike? Well, that belonged to Squire Perkins, Archibald Perkins. And he was the father of Sarah Perkins. And he decided, after he had seen the paintings that David Hoadley had done, that George Dury had done for the occupants of the Hoadley house, the Wheelers, that he wanted his family done as well. And the tradition is that he painted all of the members of Squire Perkins' household, but the painting of Sarah Perkins took an especially long time. Sometime after having completed it, he married Sarah Perkins, and they were married in this church. So there's good reason to connect George Dury and our church here. Incidentally, to give you an idea of the importance of this particular, the original of this particular painting is, it today hangs in the White House in Washington. Kind of like this early photograph of the Congregational Church, probably around 1890 to 1900. It shows the original steeple. I sure hope the church committee is going to make it look something like this when they put a steeple back, and not put up something that should be in another town, maybe Litchfield or something like that. I mean, that's what our steeple is supposed to look like. Unfortunately, a hurricane knocked that section off, and more recently, deterioration has necessitated removal of the belfry entirely. You notice there's church sheds here. These were for accommodating carriages and sleighs in inclement weather. If you go back, you'll see church sheds shown in here too. Whether they were really there or not, I don't know. Probably not. Probably some artistic license here. However, the Episcopal Church did have sheds, much as the Congregational Church here has sheds. As a matter of fact, they're still there. The sheds that you probably noticed when you drive by in front of across from the Episcopal Church are the remnants of a somewhat larger building. It was a little longer on both ends, I believe, that accommodated the horse-drawn equipment used by early parishioners there. My understanding is that that's the only surviving church shed left in Connecticut. No one's been able to prove to me that there's another. Almost every church would have had one in the old days. And this is the bell that recently was removed. It was cast in 1851. You can't read it, partially because it's on the other side of the bell. But it was cast in 1851. Very nice bell. It's now restored. It was taken down only a short time ago. Put this in here. This is an early Bethany foot warmer. Churches were cold, services were long, even longer than tonight's talk. And people were uncomfortable, even more uncomfortable than you are. And on top of that, they were cold, which is something you don't have to worry about. And they put some charcoal in there and put their feet on it. At least the ladies would, and black robe, and they'd have some semblance of heat. Luckily, the old churches were drafty, and they didn't have to worry about carbon monoxide. I don't know about burning their shoes. This is a title slide. I just couldn't resist using this to introduce the concept that Bethany was incorporated in 1832. This particular stone is one of the stones that was laid out in 1832 to mark the division between Bethany and Woodbridge. And if you look very carefully, 1, 8, 3, 2. And this is just along the road on Downs Road. It's still there. You have to hunt for it a little bit, but it's still there. There are others too. All of the town bounds were marked and regularly perambulated by the selectmen up until I think it was the late 30s. Might have been 1939 or something is the last time they were perambulated. So somebody might be stealing land from us and we wouldn't know it. Okay, 1832. What happened in 1832? Well, we already had a parish of Bethany. We already have our own church. We already have our own school. We have our own minister. We have 2 churches, as a matter of fact. We have a congregational church and an Episcopal church where they stand today. The same buildings that you drive by every day. The same 2 buildings that appear on our town seal. I just threw this in here because I happened to run across this. This is one of the things that people were interested in. Evidently, this is some indirect evidence of some sort of immoderation on the part of early residents. A lot of other things, before I get to this, a lot of other things happened in 1832. Interestingly enough, some of the things that the selectmen were concerned about first were taking care of paupers, making a workhouse for paupers. One of the first things they did was appoint a committee to buy a hearse. Hard to believe that we would do that today, but that was something that was of grave interest to them. Am I being attacked here? Is it that bad? Okay. One other little sidelight before I get onto this interesting little church is that in 1833, the last group of adult Pagusset Indians who originally inhabited Bethany were wiped out by smallpox. But they were not living in Bethany. They were living in Derby. Because I have only read this, I have not researched it, and it probably would be Woodbridge selectmen, but the tradition is that the selectmen, in order to eliminate being responsible for individuals who might be a drain on community coffers, as far as, I guess we'd call it today, welfare, they bought a piece of property in Derby and relocated the Mack family from Bethany to Derby at town expense. Today in the South they call that greyhound therapy. But at any rate, the Indians died, all of the adults died off of smallpox and were buried there. And there is a small cemetery on what's now Ansonia Derby Water Company land in Derby. Moving on to this slide, this is the old Methodist cemetery. I don't know how many of you remember this. It stood on the Litchfield Turnpike, somewhat north of Hatfield Hill Road, the west side of the road. A very quaint little plain church. I can remember going to summer services here on occasion, as late as in the late 40s or very early 50s. Just on occasion it was open. It was in very poor condition then. It never had electricity or running water. Eventually it was torn down in 1955, I believe. The materials were moved to western Bethany on what's now Route 42, and it was going to be, the timbers were going to be used for building I believe a Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall or something. They built the foundation, put up a few timbers, and that's about it. If you go there today, there are a couple of the old chestnut timbers that are still in place. And that was placed in 1955 when the church was torn down. The cemetery, of course, is still there. This particular slide is here to show you. I don't know if you can read it or not. I guess we're too far away. That says Naugatuck. This is the present Bethany Naugatuck town line, and this is here to indicate one step in the reduction of Bethany in size. In 1832, we consisted of a town that included part of what is now Naugatuck, the Straitsville area, the area just north of the Naugatuck line. This was taken away in 1844 in order to form the town of Naugatuck. Okay, we might as well we're giving you some of the highlights of Bethany history. Now we're going to give you some of the lowlights of Bethany history. This particular location, though not this house, on Downs Road, was the site of a brutal murder. Actually, a double murder took place in 1856. A kind of demented, I don't know if we call him a religious zealot today, felt that God had told him that he was to eliminate certain undesirable people, and one of the people that was killed was the occupant of this land, and where this house stood on Downs Road and Brooks Road. And the gentleman that was killed was Ichabod Umberfield. Excellent name. And he was murdered with an axe, as was Enoch Sperry, who lived over, if you've ever been to Sperry Falls, that's the area where the Sperrys live. And so Charlie Sanford committed this terrible crime on January 1st, 1856. It says, in memory, in case you can't read it, in memory of Ichabod Umberfield, who was murdered by a maniac. See, today would have to be a lot softer than that. It would be an alleged perpetrator or something like that. Or they say to the gravestone cutter, you know, you're not trained. You can't say he's a maniac. This is in the Sperry Cemetery. Enoch Sperry is buried in Westville. Okay, on a little lighter note, it wasn't all work and no play, I guess, in those days. Starting in about 1858, there were annual fairs that were held. A cooperative fair between between Bethany and Woodbridge, and it was put on by the Woodbridge and Bethany Agricultural Society. On certain years, the fairs were held in Woodbridge, and very often alternate years they were held in Bethany. And this is the area where they were held. This is the field that located on Woodward Farm, still known to the Woodwards as the Fair Lot, even though there hasn't been a fair here probably for over 90 years, close to a century, but they still call it the Fair Lot. And this is how Fairwood Road got its name, from the fairs and the fact that the land belonged to the Woodleys. I threw this in because it's just a nice fall scene. It was taken in October, and the fairs were held in early October. I believe the one that you saw for 1865, I believe, was 1869. The one for 1869 was on the, I guess it was October 6th. And that's about when this photograph was taken, with the corn stalks and the pumpkins. I have another broadside home for the fair from 1856 that says, invites you to spend the day, and I quote, among pretty girls and big pumpkins. Yeah, which is, kind of nice, and we have, certainly have the big pumpkins there. Just to mention the Civil War, again, I'm going to try to keep the political of it as kind of brief, because I know it's going to be, isn't the most exciting part, but it was a war that involved lots of Bethany people. No one has really done a lot of research on this, but there are a lot of Bethany people that didn't live to very old age as a result of this war. Amazing numbers of people. I've read, I think it was Arthur Doolittle that wrote that, and I won't say this is correct, but I think he said there were 16 boys went to the war from what he called his block. And I think he means the area, I won't swear to it, I think he means the area pretty much circumscribed by Brooks, Downs, and Carmel Road. But he may include a little larger area. But that's a lot of people. There were several from the Brooks family who lived on Brooks Road. Okay, we're going to do something different. This is our little break period. We've been going chronologically, and that can be pretty boring. So we're going to stop the clock right now. And we're not going forward in time. We're going to stop, and we're going to look at Bethany at a point in time, as if we had a time machine and we could just step back and see what people were doing at that time. I particularly like this map. It was issued in 1868, and it appeared in Beer's Atlas of New Haven County. They had a map of every town in New Haven County, and they're excellent and complete maps. They have the most complete river and road configurations to date. They also list all of the houses and the owners, and they also list all of the mills, all of the blacksmith shops, all of the taverns. One thing I want to point out before we go on is that Bethany here is a little bigger than it is today. We've already lost this area up here, the northern area of Straitsville, north of the Straits. But notice that this area here is part of Beacon Falls today, was part of Bethany. And it was the most populous part of Bethany. It had mills. If you look here, this is a close-up of that. There are woolen mills. There is a railroad just on the west side of the river. Bethany had a railroad within literally a stone's throw. We had a covered bridge that we were responsible for half the cost of. So if you read in the early records about repairs to a covered bridge, you say, wait a minute, Bethany had a covered bridge? Yes, it did. The Beacon Falls Historical Society has a photograph of this bridge, which was washed away in a flood, and I don't know what year. I would like to get a copy of it. One of my little projects. These various colors are school districts, and we're going to be talking about schools a little bit later. So it's showing school districts, it's showing taverns, blacksmith shops, mills, as well as houses. And what kind of houses? Well, farmhouses generally. In 1868, most people, if you look at the census statistics, you're going to find that most people were farmers at that time. Most people also did something else to make a buck, but most were basically farmers. I show Alvin Eisenman's house because it's kind of nice to show the early house, and this is Carrington Road, which probably doesn't look too much different than it would have in 1868, which is, remember, our target date. Beef cattle, there also would have been dairy cattle. I had to cut the dairy cattle because we didn't have enough room for them. Also try to get you something that's a little bit photogenic too. This is the right time of year for my son to be taking photos. Almost all of these were taken by my son Will. He's our photographer, so you owe him a vote of thanks. Even, now this is a copy that I used at my other talk, but I just like it so well that I had to use it again. This is typical transportation in 1868. A few people had buggies, but not everybody. A farmer without too much money, if he can only afford one-wheeled vehicle, it's not going to be a buggy, because you can't haul hay in a buggy. You can't haul manure or sawdust. That may be sawdust. This is on the early farm, and he may be hauling sawdust from a mill for bedding or something like that. I can't tell what he's got in. I mentioned the last time I showed this that these are Joe and Dutch. They're clearly marked on the back of the photo, but we're not told who the driver is. That's a recycled joke. Barns. A lot of times when we think about rural character and the way people lived, we kind of omit and forget about barns. But barns were extremely important. They were so important that sometimes people would build a barn before they built their house in those days. Of course, zoning wouldn't allow that today. Is that right, Mr. Johnson? This particular barn I picked out, I just kind of liked it. It's on the Poletsky property. You probably drive by it every day, never notice it. And I couldn't resist an interior shot because barns have a special magic of their own. The light coming through the knot holes, and this particular barn is kind of has an interesting framing. I've never seen this before. In order to support this, this is the hay loft. There's also another floor down here where you have your animals, your threshing floor and the floor for animals. But they must have used this, designed this original kind of a king post truss to support the floor. Probably more than support the roof. Other buildings that would have been found on a barn, on a farm, would have included something like this. No, it's not. It's not what you're thinking. This is a smokehouse. This is on the Halter farm. When Will and I were taking photographs in the last few weeks, we found so far 3 smokehouses left in Bethany. Maybe you know of more. You can't neglect the necessities of life. This necessary house, which is on the Woodward farm, this is something that you would find in the back of every farm. We have to give you the complete picture. One thing that farmers could do, this is an industry, but it's, and that is the making of charcoal. And it was an industry that a farmer could do during his off-season. He could harvest some of the lumber that wasn't particularly valuable and make it into charcoal, which was readily saleable. It was a cash crop in Bethany. Lots of people engaged in making charcoal. This particular charcoal mound was up probably on the Tuttle farm. This is Irving Tuttle on the top. It was taken about 1900 by George Levi Woody. I can remember Irving Tuttle, so I guess I must mean I'm getting to be an old timer or something like that. And the way this was done was you cut wood with an axe, you stacked a tight stack of wood, and you covered it with wet leaves and grass and anything else that would make kind of a damp cover over it, and then you covered that with earth. You built the fire in the center, and you severely restricted the air going into the pile, so there'd be a lack of oxygen. And you would have to watch the pile, because one false move, if it broke through and burst into flames, it was all over. There's no way you could put this fire out. You could stand back, if you had marshmallows, you'd be all set, but there's nothing you could do. If you fell into the fire, I mean, he's standing up on top. Imagine if that got hollowed out and he fell in. They're extremely sooty job. A man would be black from head to foot after burning one of these. And these had to burn for days, and you couldn't leave them. In Bethany Town Hall, there's a companion photograph of this showing a hut that they would have been built nearby for the tenders to sleep in, and they would take turns sleeping. You would have to tend the fire on a 24-hour-a-day basis. And this was done all over the town. I believe there are a couple of these, a couple of evidences of these north of Valley Road that I found some years ago. Just very quickly, I want to mention the schoolhouses. Remember we said the very first public edifice in the town was a schoolhouse. These are subsequent schoolhouses. These are probably the schoolhouses you would have seen in 1868. I would probably have to think twice about that. One of them, that might be a replacement. Some of the schoolhouses were built and then torn down and another one rebuilt. Sometimes 3 schoolhouses stood on the same site. Going clockwise here, I think we're going to find the Downs Road School. This is Center School. This is Smith School. Oh, those don't mean anything to me. Tell me where they are. All right, and you did. The Downs Road School was on Downs Road, obviously, south of Hatfield Hill. Center School stood originally where the Center Firehouse is. Later it was moved to the athletic field, and of course now it's been restored and is between our present town hall and our community school. Smith School stood on the Carrington Road, north of Porter Hill, north of Davidson's Corner. Yates School stood up near the toll gate, near Route 42 and present-day Amity Road. And Beecher School stood on Sperry Road. That's also been moved across the road. Between Hatfield Hill Road and Beth Road. And these are basically the 5 school districts that you saw. Each one of them had just one room. This is kind of interesting. I ran across this document with some of our schoolhouse papers. This is the original bill for the Center Schoolhouse. Center Schoolhouse is an exception. We only had one schoolhouse there. We built it in 1834, and we still got it. We didn't sell it. All the other schoolhouses that you saw are still standing, the other 4, but each of them has been sold to a private party and been made into a residence. Center School was used for 100 years, from 1834 until 1934, when our current community school was built. And this is the bill for it. It cost $100. $100. And this is signed by the schoolhouse committee. It's not very often you have the original bill for a document, for a structure that's that old. And those are the years that it was used. Next week we're going to be talking about Center School being recycled as a firehouse and then as an athletic association meeting room, and finally as a restored schoolhouse where it is today. Okay, we're going to switch from education to industry. And there were a number of mills in the town. It was not a major industry, but basically any place that there was a brook, where there's running water and a drop where you could build a dam, get some water to go through a raceway and put it into a water wheel, put it over a water wheel, later on through a turbine, and get some power out of that, mills were built. This is the Twitchell Mill in the northern part of Bethany. It's since been moved across the brook. This part is now destroyed. The front part belongs to the Connecticut Water Company, and is being used as a rental residence. Edwards Road is just about in here today. This is the bridge, or guardrail or something, right near where present-day Litchfield Turnpike passes near Edwards Road. And this was a textile mill. Now, I'm a little fuzzy on what they exactly did there. I know I've read that they did fulling, which is a similar process to a mill that they have up at Sturbridge. And they evidently did several processes that had to do with the manufacture of textiles. I couldn't resist this. We had to give you a few scenics because this is something you don't very often see. This is on the Connecticut Water Company property, way up in back of the Twitchell Mill. This is the mill pond that fed the mill. The water company still calls it Twitchell Pond, and this is their distribution reservoir. They're still using mill pond as their distribution reservoir. In 1915, they built a much larger reservoir above it, but it only feeds water into this distribution reservoir, which is still what they're using. Okay, probably you can already see that we're going to be talking about grist mills. There were a number of grist mills. People had grain. It had to be ground. We already mentioned that there was a grist mill on Hilldale Road, called at one time Kelly Road, or Kelly Hill Road, and the mill was called Kelly Mill. This is not it. This is the millstone from the Hoadley Mills. And most people don't realize the millstones are still around. But this is on private property, along with several other millstones from the mill. This one is, I chose this particular one because it's in excellent condition. It was evidently fairly newly cut before the mill was abandoned. Hoadley Mills were probably our most extensive series of mills in Bethany. In other words, instead of having just a single use, like a sawmill or a grist mill, Hoadley Mills combined a grist mill, as indicated on the from that millstone that you just saw, and a separate sawmill, and in conjunction with that, several other endeavors, several other manufacturing processes that were utilized over the years. This is there are a number of views of Hoadley Mills. This is on water company property now, that in this case South Central Regional Water. This is Hoadley Road, where probably the photographer was standing on the present-day Hoadley Bridge. And probably the bridge abutments are the same ones that were here when this picture was taken. This wall is still here. This wall is still there. All of the other, the house across the way, and the mill, of course, have all been torn down. There's also some sad stories associated with this mill. Gary Hoadley, who lived across the road and operated the mill in the mid-19th century, the time we're talking about, lost two children. One was a 2-year-old girl that fell into the mill pond and drowned, even less than 2, real youngster. And the other was a young boy, 14 or I think he was 14 years old, and he was running the grist mill all by himself. And I read the account in some grisly details that he was caught up in the machinery, and his mother heard the mill slowing down, so she came down to investigate, and he was instantly killed by being caught in the machinery. And those were the good old days. There's a combined gravestone in the Methodist cemetery. If you're looking for it, look for the huge spruce tree in the center of the cemetery. Immediately in back of that, you'll see a small double stone, and it has the two children on it, and one says drowned, and one says accidentally killed. And underneath that it says, "The Lord is just." Often wondered about that. Okay, this is a photograph that I showed last Tuesday. I don't think those of you who came last Tuesday are going to see too many repeats. I couldn't resist this one. This is a little better copy than I had last week. I redid it. It's a copy of a 1906 photograph of the Chatfield sawmill, which stood at the north of Hinman Road on Bear Hill Road. And this is the mill. The mill pond is back in here, probably the dam. You can't see the dam. Here you can just see a horse and carriage. You can't see, but take my word for it. I never liked it. Horse and carriage crossing the bridge. And the bridge abutments are still there. The bridge is now down. It's been down less than 10 years, probably about 6 or 8 years. Something you probably don't realize, this is a horizontal shaft turbine that ran the Perkins sawmill. And the Perkins sawmill was located in the northern part of the town, just west of present-day Amity Road, almost opposite where the trailer park is, a little bit to the south. And the mill was taken down in the 1950s, but this turbine that ran the mill was down underneath it. The mill equipment was sold, like most of the equipment, during the Second World War for scrap. There were scrap drives, and every patriotic person got all the scrap metal together that they could find, and a lot of equipment disappeared. But I guess they felt that the old turbine and this the long pipe that led down into it. Originally there was a box here, a wooden box, you can see the ruins of it, that took the water and brought it into the turbine to turn the vanes and turning the pulleys along the mill. I'm going to cheat here a little bit, finishing up the mill segment, because I'm going to go a couple years later. This mill wasn't built until 1876, at least this particular one. Whether there was an earlier one on the site, I don't know. This particular mill is on Downs Road, just off to the west of Downs Road, just north of the Bethany town line. And we're looking at the mill proper, and there's some equipment there, and this is a dam. It's a beautiful dam, probably about 25 feet high, still in excellent condition. This is a view from the dam looking down at the Brinton sawmill, sometimes known later as Ball's Mill. Underneath the mill, some of the equipment is still present. I don't know if you can see the shafting along there. There's a good deal of shafting. Counter shafting on the ceiling. The mill was run by a tub mill. This is one with a vertical shaft where the water came down from the dam, down through a pipe, turned a tub mill, which turned a shaft and a bevel gear and ran these pulleys, which in turn were hooked to those pulleys, which ran saws and planers. Upstairs there was a workroom that was utilized for manufacturing of things like wagon parts. Upstairs there's still patterns on the wall of wagon parts and things like eveners and whiffle trees. I'm not sure I could tell you which is which. And some of them have dates on them. The patterns have been there for a considerable time. Pattern is just a little thin piece of wood that you trace onto a heavier piece. One of the patterns said S. Woodward, 1912. Interesting, I don't know how many of you knew that there was still a water-powered mill in Bethany that is virtually ready to operate. The owner is unwilling to try and operate it because he probably rightly fears that if the gate hadn't been opened in about 20 years, if he went to use it, he may not be able to turn off the water, and he'd end up with the mill running, but maybe with an empty pond. Incidentally, while I'm here, we're going to touch on this mill a little bit next week, because this mill goes right up to date. This little room back here was a generator room, and a generator stood in there generating power for a house across the road that went with this property. Downs Road didn't get electricity until 1947. I don't know how many of you realize that. So this water power mill was still producing electricity up until 1947. It was still, the sawmill was still operational until early 1950s. They were still sawing wood with water power until the early 1950s in this mill on Downs Road. Okay, we're a little better off with mills. We have some photos, we have some ruins. We don't have a photo of a blacksmith shop. There were many blacksmith shops in Bethany, on Peck Road, on Litchfield Turnpike, on Amity Road, on, actually there were 3 on Litchfield Turnpike. There were a lot of blacksmith shops. There were a lot of horses that had to be shod. More than that, there were a lot of tools and implements that had to be built or repaired. This particular one, here we go back again to George Dury. This is from a sketchbook that George Dury's that's presently in the New Haven Colony Historical Society. Now this is his blacksmith shop, Bethany, August 1859. I'm pretty sure that would have been there in our 1868 period that we're homing in on. It's the only drawing that I know of. If anybody knows of a photograph of a Bethany blacksmith shop, I sure would like to have an opportunity to copy it. This particular blacksmith shop later became a subject for one of Dury's paintings, at least I think so. And that painting became a print, and this is the print. Of course, he added, he always added the oxen and the horse and the load of wood and everything like that. And he added the mountains in the background and some clouds. But I'm going to go back again. I just want you to notice the configuration of the this is called a blacksmith shop in winter. That's the name of this painting. But I want you to notice the configuration. You probably can't see it, but the doors and the hinges and many things are the same. The only thing he did is he reversed it. So I cheated. I reversed it too. I reversed this slide. Otherwise, it doesn't look so much the same. Okay, ready? Go back to this. So I submit that that's definitely, since in 1859 he was in Bethany, he was spending time in Bethany, singing in the choir in the Episcopal Church. If he made a drawing of a blacksmith shop, I'm pretty sure that's a painting. This is the old Perkins Tavern, which stood up at the corner of present northwest corner of Route 42, Beacon Road, and Litchfield Turnpike. And it burned in 1903. And it was a very famous tavern. This is not the one with the bad reputation.
That's my house.
That's well, now we're up to present day. This is the old cemetery. I highly recommend that you visit this. If you have any interest in cemeteries or picturesque spots, there's an old iron gate. There's a stile, which is a series of stone steps that allows you to go over a wall, but not animals, because animals were kept out of the cemeteries in the old days. They still are. There are many, over in this area, there are many early stones. Some of them are really sad, especially the children. There's one family, the Terrell family, that was entirely wiped out, or nearly wiped out in 1794. Probably smallpox. It just would decimate families. I think they lost 7 members or something. They have all the stones in a row. I don't have photographs of all the cemeteries in town because we don't have room for them all, and I think you can find them. But there, in 1868, there are 7 cemeteries in Bethany. I don't know if you knew that. Presently, there are 6 cemeteries in Bethany. Well, more about that later. Okay, what are the 7 cemeteries? Well, on the west side of town, you've got the old cemetery on the south. Going up Amity Road, you then have the Congregational Cemetery across from the firehouse, and then beyond that, in back of the Episcopal Church, you have the Episcopal Cemetery. Okay, that's 3. On the east side of town, on the Litchfield Turnpike, you have the Sperry Cemetery. That's across from my house. Then you have north of that the Methodist Cemetery. We already talked about that. And then north of that on Rainbow Road, we have the Carrington Cemetery. Fine, that's only 6. What happened to the 7th? The 7th one was the Lounsbury Cemetery. And you probably can't read it. Neither can I. The Lounsbury Cemetery stood on Lounsbury Road, or Lounsbury Street, whatever it was called. Present-day Route 42, present-day Beacon Road. Those of you who are familiar with the town, it was opposite the southern end of Little Beacon Road. There's a little dip in the road, and that's where the cemetery was located. This stone tells that the bodies were moved in 1902 to the Episcopal Cemetery. And this brings us to Beacon Road. This is not the spot where the cemetery was, but you have to use your imagination and go back about 1.5 miles. I've had conflicting stories about the location, about what happened to the cemetery. I know bodies were moved in 1902, but I've also had somebody tell me that there was evidence of the cemetery later than that. From the best information I can get is that Route 42 goes over the site of the old Lounsbury Cemetery. It's probably entirely covered by fill at this particular point. And whether all the graves were moved or not, I don't know. It's probably a moot point. But that's the cemetery that we lost. It was pretty much a family cemetery. There were a great number of Lounsburys that lived on Beacon Road at that time. Okay, highlights and lowlights. I think we're back to lowlights again. This house, this is a current photograph of a house on Wooding Hill Road that was the site of a brutal murder. You probably haven't had a murder in about 20 minutes, so we're ready for another one. This was, can we live without it? This was the home of Wales Doolittle, who was a large, kind of a brutish man who evidently had a penchant for strong drink. Probably he was born too late for that temperance society, and would have been better off with its benefits. And he brutally murdered a hired man by the name of William Ford, who was fairly diminutive and somewhat frail. And there's a very graphic description of the murder that I won't relate to you in detail. However, I think the beating took 3 or 4 hours before Ford finally died. And since he was impoverished, since he had no funds, he was buried in a pauper's grave and simply the number 375. And this is William Ford's gravestone in the back of the Carrington Cemetery on Rainbow Road. Okay, we're going, I don't know if you noticed or not, but when we got to the Beacon Falls line, I meant to mention, and I skipped one, that in 1871, Beacon Falls, that part of Beacon Falls that used to be Bethany, broke away, which caused a great decline in our population. Not because people moved, but because just, part of the town was cut away. And so we became a much more rural town. We no longer had the industries, the population. We also didn't have all the immigrants. If you look at the census statistics or the census tracts for the 1860s, Bethany had a lot of immigrants. But in 1880, no, because the immigrants were mostly factory workers that were in Beacon Falls. This is Perry's Hall, built in around 1875. It stood kind of across from the Congregational Church and south of the Child's House. And it was the site of the early town meetings. At this time, it was the biggest hall in the town. We had no town hall until 1914. We'll be getting into that next week. But this is where this is laid out for supper. This building, of course, is gone. These benches, I don't know, some of you may recall those. This is 1875, but I can remember sitting on those benches in the town hall. These benches were moved to the town hall when it was built in 1914. And some of these are still around. There's one in our schoolhouse, for instance. I don't have a clue why this is here. Willie, can you help me on this one?
I think this is just the scene.
Okay. It's a good one. I don't have a clue though. This is, oh yes I do. Yeah, this is Lake Watrous on Downs Road. And I guess we're going to be talking about some changes that took place to the town just before the turn of the century. We're almost through for those of you who are getting kind of tired. This, to a great extent, has influenced the way Bethany looks today. If you're going to study history outside just the interest of what happened in the past, it's good to know how we got to where we are. And one of the reasons that Bethany's a rural town, only one of the reasons is the water company, actually 3 water companies, started buying up land in Bethany just before the turn of the century. This particular lake was built in, I think it was 1886. It was in the 1880s anyway. This is the first lake in Bethany to be built for water supply purposes. Only part of it, by the way, only the northern part is in Bethany. The southern part is in that other town. This is a plaque on the Lake Bethany Dam showing it was built in 1892. About the same time, we have, this is the lake at low tide. I don't know if you've noticed, but we had such a dry summer that Bethany Lake, which is used as a reserve to keep the lower lakes filled, has been kind of drained down. Maybe there. Let you look at the foliage there for a minute. Remember, if we were back in the 19th century, those would all be fields. You wouldn't see all those trees. You can't even see Litchfield Turnpike is probably in there somewhere. You can't even see it. Lake Chamberlain was built about the same time, totally in Bethany, west of Sperry Road. Fortunately, the Water Authority has allowed us to use this property and enjoy it on a permit basis. Before that, it was largely isolated. It's the only lake that can't be seen from any road. Okay, we're just about finished here. I don't know how many of you knew that in 1898, Tyler Davidson, a civic-minded person in town and also a farmer and to some extent a businessman, felt a need to bring Bethany up to speed with the rest of the country. As a matter of fact, we were ahead of many parts of the country. We had a telephone system in Bethany in 1898, and it was Tyler Davidson's telephone company. He had the switchboard in his house. Initially, the wires between houses were strung on trees. He mentions in his journal there was an ice storm, and a lot of the trees that wires were attached to fell, and service was interrupted. He did put up poles, however, eventually, and these were the cedars cut from Lebanon swamp before the turn of the century. Incidentally, this stayed in business until 1907. So we're beginning to get some modernization, some hints that Bethany is beginning to recognize some of the coming technology. We're going to finish up here with what Bethany looked like about 1900. We're looking south here from about where the library driveway is. This is Amity Road with just ruts, and it's kind of windy before it was straightened and widened. The Congregational Church, complete with its spire, the Episcopal Church. This particular scene could have been 1831 just as easily, or 1832, excuse me, just as easily, except for the very first sign of the oncoming 20th century. And that's it. Until next week. catch the lights there for me. Watch the cords if, take, why not? Sure. If anybody has any questions or anything that I can answer, or if you want some facts for me to make up, I'd be happy to do it.